The world knew him as the god who commanded 72,000 people at Wembley with a single finger gesture. But on that foggy November morning in 1991, behind Garden Lodge's high walls, all that remained of that immense power was a tired breath and flickering candlelight. The stage lights had gone dark. The famous yellow jacket hung forgotten in a closet. This wasn't rock history's greatest show. This was its most heartbreaking farewell. Freddie Mercury was preparing to sing the hardest song of his life, but this time there weren't thousands beside him. Just three men he called my brothers. This isn't a story about a legend ending. It's about a promise being sealed into eternity, a vow that would keep Queen alive long after Freddie's voice went silent. November 1991. London's cold froze, even the flowers in Garden Lodge's garden, while inside time seemed suspended. Freddie had become physically very weak. According to Peter Freestone, the energetic man who could never sit still was gone. In his place sat a dignified sage who chose every word with surgical precision. For Brian May, Roger Taylor, and John Deacon, walking through that door meant leaving pieces of their hearts behind. They'd come over those final weeks never knowing which visit might be the last. Each time they climbed those stairs, the weight grew heavier. Not from the stairs, from knowing what waited at the top. The man who'd defined their lives for 20 years was slipping away, and there was nothing any of them could do except be present, hold his hand, pretend normalcy when nothing would ever be normal again. Outside, the world plastered Freddie's illness across headlines, creating gossip and treating his dying like entertainment. Inside that room existed only one rule: normalcy and love. When his brothers visited, Freddie removed his pain like a costume, greeted them with that famous darling, and made jokes about doctors or medications or anything to avoid becoming a living funeral. He refused to let them mourn him while he still breathed. Brian said later that Freddie's bravery wasn't about facing death. It was about protecting them from watching him be afraid. Roger said Freddie was directing his own ending the way he'd directed every Queen performance, with control, with awareness of exactly what impression he wanted to leave. John said nothing publicly, but those who knew him said he never fully recovered from watching Freddie diminish, from seeing rock's most powerful voice reduced to whispers. Then one evening, everything changed. After doctors had left and medications had been administered and Freddie had managed a few bites of food that Jim Hutton had lovingly prepared, Brian and Roger were sitting with him. John stood by the window watching Freddie's beloved cats play in fading light. The room was quiet in that way. Rooms get when everyone thinks the same thing, but nobody speaks it. Freddie was dying. They all knew. Doctors had stopped talking treatments and started talking comfort, making his remaining time painless, preparing for inevitable. But in that room, nobody said those words. They just existed together. Four men who'd spent 20 years creating music that would outlive them. Four men who'd started as strangers and become family in the truest sense. Not through blood, through choice. They'd chosen each other every single day for 2 decades, through arguments and exhaustion and creative differences and fame's crushing pressure and everything that should have torn them apart. They'd chosen to stay family. Without warning, Freddie reached out and took Brian's hand. The gesture was so deliberate that all three immediately focused completely on him. Brian's hand was rough from decades playing that homemade guitar. Freddie's hand was thin and fragile now, bones visible under almost translucent skin, but the grip was firm, purposeful. Freddie's eyes opened fully and looked directly at Brian, then Roger, then John, who turned from the window, sensing the moment's importance. "Brian, darling, look at me," Freddie whispered. His voice wasn't the 4-octave hurricane that had shaken stadiums, barely louder than a child's bedtime whisper, but carrying absolute authority, the authority of someone whose time is measured in days, not years, and who makes every word count. Brian leaned closer. Roger sat forward. John came to stand at the bed's foot. All three focused completely on Freddie with intensity that made the world disappear. Freddie looked at each in turn. Really looked. The way you look when memorizing faces, taking mental photographs because there won't be another chance. His dark eyes, still bright despite illness ravaging his body, moved from Brian to Roger to John and back. "You three," he said slowly, each word an effort but delivered with that particular Mercury precision. You're not just band members to me. You're my real family in this world. My heart's brothers. The words hung suspended, simple words carrying 20 years' weight, arguments and reconciliations, creative battles and collaborative triumphs, touring buses and recording studios, and stage after stone, building something together bigger than any individual. Brian's eyes filled with tears. Roger was trying to hold together and failing. John's face was completely still, but his clenched hands showed the emotion he wouldn't otherwise express. But here's what nobody expected. What made this moment transform from sentimental goodbye into something that would change music history? Freddie wasn't finished. He'd gathered them for a reason beyond making sure they knew he loved them. He had something they needed to promise, something crucial that would determine what happened after he was gone. The room went completely silent except for a clock's ticking and Freddie's labored breathing. Outside, London continued. Cars drove past. People lived normal lives. Inside that bedroom, time had stopped. The three men surrounding Freddie's bed waited. They knew something important was coming. Could feel it in how Freddie's grip had tightened despite his weakness. Could see it in his eyes, which had taken on that look he got before important creative decisions. That focus, that certainty. I need you to promise me something, Freddie said, voice quiet but absolutely clear. Every word precisely formed. Every syllable carrying weight. Brian nodded. Roger whispered anything. John stood completely still, but his presence was total agreement. Whatever Freddie needed, they would give. When I leave this stage, Freddie continued, and the metaphor was deliberate, not when I die, but when I leave this stage, because his whole life had been performance, and even death was just an exit. Don't stop the music. Don't close the piano and mourn. Don't let Queen end because I'm not there. He paused, gathering strength for what came next. The most important part, the actual request that would determine everything. I want people to remember Queen not just as a band, but as hope, as something that doesn't die when one person leaves. The silence that followed was absolute. This wasn't what they'd expected. Last words of love maybe, personal messages, apologies or confessions or things people say when dying. But this was Freddie being Freddie until the very end, not thinking about himself, thinking about legacy, about fans, about making sure everything they'd created together would outlive him. But he still wasn't finished. There was more, the part that would haunt them in the best possible way for decades to come. Let my voice go silent, he whispered. And the irony of that magnificent voice saying those words was almost unbearable. But let Brian's guitar still shake arenas. Let Roger's drums still thunder. Let John's bass still hold the foundation. You three can carry this forward. Because it was never just me, it was always us, always the four of us together, and three can keep that alive. He looked at each with such intensity they felt like he was branding this moment into their souls, making sure they'd remember, making sure they understood how serious this was. This wasn't a dying man's sentimental wish. This was an assignment, a mission, the most important thing Freddie would ever ask. Most people thought Freddie's final days were just about suffering, pain and medication, and waiting for the end. They didn't understand. Until his very last breath, Freddie was building Queen's future, making sure the three men who'd been his brothers for 20 years understood their responsibility, their sacred duty. The show must go on, he told them, not as metaphor, actually go on, perform, tour, let other singers help carry vocals so the songs don't die. Queen will still be Queen even when I'm gone. And they promised, all three, made a vow that night in that bedroom that they would keep Queen alive, would make sure Freddie's legacy wasn't just recordings and memories, but a living, continuing force in music. That vow, made with Freddie holding their hands and looking into their eyes with that fierce Mercury intensity, became the foundation of everything that came after. It's why Queen didn't end when Freddie died, why Brian and Roger still perform decades later, why they've allowed other vocalists to help carry the songs forward, why they've protected the legacy so fiercely while also letting it grow and evolve, because they promised, and you don't break a vow made to your dying brother. After Freddie had exhausted himself with speaking and fallen into restless sleep, the three sat together in another room. Nobody spoke for a long time. What was there to say? They just vowed to a dying man they would spend the rest of their lives maintaining his legacy, had committed to carrying Queen forward without the person who'd made Queen what it was. The responsibility felt crushing. How do you continue without Freddie Mercury? How do you perform Bohemian Rhapsody without that voice? How do you command a crowd without that presence? But they'd promised, so they would find a way. Had to. Because the alternative, letting Queen die with Freddie, was unthinkable. Would mean his whole speech had been for nothing. Would mean they'd failed him in the most important request he'd ever made. Brian later said that night was when he understood what Freddie had really been asking. Not just to keep performing, but to transform grief into art. To take their love for him and their devastation at losing him and channel it into making sure his message lived forever. To turn tragedy into legacy. Make his death not an ending, but a transformation. November 24th, 1991. Early evening, Garden Lodge's lights were warm against cold London darkness. Inside, in his bedroom, surrounded by those who loved him most, Freddie Mercury took his final breath. Jim Hutton held one hand. Mary Austin was there. And somewhere in the house or arriving were Brian, Roger, and John, the three brothers. The men who just days earlier made him a vow that would define the rest of their lives. When news broke, the world mourned. Headlines screamed about the loss. Fans gathered outside Garden Lodge, leaving flowers and notes and teddy bears. The music industry eulogized one of its greatest voices. But inside, three men were thinking about a vow, about a responsibility that had just activated, about what came next now that Freddie was gone and they were the guardians of everything he'd built. The funeral was private, traditional Zoroastrian ceremony as Freddie had wanted. Brian, Roger, and John attended, stood together as they'd stood for 20 years. But this time with a hole in their formation that would never be filled. The space where Freddie had stood was empty and would remain empty forever. But the vow they'd made meant that empty space wouldn't mean silence, wouldn't mean the end, would mean transformation. In the months and years that followed, they honored that vow, slowly at first, carefully. The world wasn't sure it wanted Queen without Freddie Mercury. Brian and Roger weren't sure they could be Queen without Freddie Mercury. But they'd promised, so they tried. Small performances, tributes, charity concerts, testing whether the music could survive without the voice that had defined it. And something remarkable happened. The music did survive, because Freddie had been right. Queen was never just him, it was the four of them together. And while three remained, the essential core remained. The guitar work Brian had developed over decades. The drumming Roger had perfected. The bass lines John had created before he eventually retired from public life. Those elements still existed, still had power, still moved people. They found singers who could help carry vocals. Not replace Freddie, nobody could ever replace Freddie, but share the load. Let the songs continue being performed live instead of becoming museum pieces existing only in recordings. George Michael performed with them. Elton John, Paul Rodgers toured with them for years. Adam Lambert joined them and found a way to honor Freddie's legacy while bringing his own artistry. And through all of it, Brian and Roger made sure everyone understood they weren't replacing Freddie. They were keeping their vow to him. Doing exactly what he'd asked in that bedroom in November 1991. Making sure Queen stayed alive as a living force in music instead of becoming a nostalgia act that only looked backward. The Freddie Mercury tribute concert in 1992 brought 72,000 people to Wembley, the same arena where Freddie had commanded the crowd at Live Aid, the same venue where he'd proven Queen was the greatest live band in the world. And there, with artists from around the globe celebrating Freddie's life and music, Brian and Roger began understanding how they could keep their vow. The music was bigger than any of them, belonged to the fans as much as to the band. Keeping it alive meant sharing it, performing it, making sure new generations could experience it live instead of just through recordings. Today, more than 30 years after Freddie's death, Brian May and Roger Taylor still perform, still tour, still bring Queen's music to arenas full of people who weren't even born when Freddie was alive. When they perform We Are the Champions or Bohemian Rhapsody or Somebody to Love, Freddie's voice comes through speakers from recordings made decades ago. But the guitar and drums are live, are being played by the same men who played them when Freddie was alive, creating a bridge between past and present, between the legend who died and the legacy that lives. And every single time they perform, they're keeping that vow, honoring that promise made in a Garden Lodge bedroom in November 1991, making sure Freddie's whispered words, "Don't stop the music," remain true. Before every show, Brian has said in interviews, he thinks about that night, about Freddie's hands holding his and Roger's, about those eyes burning with intensity despite the dying body, about the words that changed everything. And he thinks, we're keeping it. We're doing what you asked. Your voice is silent, but your guitar is still shaking arenas. Your vision is still alive. We promised, and we're keeping that vow. The legacy Freddie left wasn't just in recordings or videos or memories of his performances. It was in that vow, in the responsibility he placed on his brothers to make sure Queen meant something beyond just him, to transform it from a band dependent on one irreplaceable frontman into a legend that could survive and thrive and grow even after that frontman was gone. That's the real genius of what Freddie did in those final days. He didn't just prepare to die, he prepared for life after his death, made sure the three men who loved him most understood their role in keeping him immortal. Not through statues or museums, but through living, breathing, continuing music that reached new people every single day. The words he spoke that night, "Brother, darling, forever," weren't just sentiment, they were prophecy. Were Freddie telling them that their bond wouldn't end when he died? That the brotherhood they'd formed would continue carrying them forward? That being brothers meant honoring each other's wishes even when it was hard, even when it meant performing without him, even when it meant sharing their music with singers who weren't him, even when it meant continuing when every instinct said to stop and mourn and retreat. This story teaches us something essential about what really matters. It's not measured in album sales or sold-out shows or platinum records. It's measured in the loyalty of the brothers who hold your hand when you're dying, in the vows kept after you are gone, in the legacy that continues because people loved you enough to honor your final wishes, even when honoring them was the hardest thing they had ever done. Freddie Mercury wore masks his entire life, the theatrical performer, the rock god, the legend. But that night in Garden Lodge, all masks fell away. What remained was pure love, a man telling his brothers they mattered more than anything else in his life, that their bond was eternal, that what they'd built together had to survive his death because it was too important to let die.